Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 154, and we're going to talk about starting with a cart of belief, a grocery cart of belief, and ending with eating your own. It's a very awkward title, yeah. But anyway, I was listening to a podcast, and no disrespect to that podcast, but I just wanted to hear what other Christians had to say. And there was a discussion about reconciling two apparently conflicting beliefs. I won't go into detail there, but as I was listening, I thought about how libertarians often fight with each other. It also reminds me of how pro trans people fight with feminists. It reminds me of how Marx, in chapter 3 of his manifesto, he makes great effort to distinguish his form of socialism with all other forms of socialism in order to declare that his own communism is the best. So, how does it start? Well, it starts by people latching on to an idea which, superficially understood, has wide appeal. I mean, it sounds like really good. Uh, However, each individual who latches onto that idea, they put their own spin on it. And as long as you remain superficial, you really don't talk about it all that much, everything is great, right? So equality, let's end oppression, freedom, love, peace. All of these concepts, you say, hey, I'm pro equality, I'm pro freedom, I'm pro love, I'm pro ending oppression of oppressed people, whatever. When you just listen to it, you're like, yeah, sure, I can get down with that. And so as long as you stay there, everything is great. And you can add on lots of other things too, as long as you stay superficial, right? You don't go too deep. You don't try to analyze or unpack or try to create scenarios where you're going to present a challenge to that concept. Like, how do we remain free under a tyrannical government? How do we practice love when there are multiple people who are fighting for the same love? All this kind of, difficult situations which might cause you to have to explain what you think or understand about that concept. And then how's it going? Well, eventually, as I just said, you pick out lots of other things which seem to um, fit that initial concept. So lots of people then start seeing potential for themselves, their own ideas, their own desires. And so they, start picking up lots of different concepts, or they start joining various organizations which seem to tout those particular ideas. Now, a lot of people who will gravitate in this way to not mainstream ideologies is because they were rejected by a larger group, right? So, if we were to look at libertarians, for example, a lot of people who end up in the Libertarian Party or even in the libertarian mindset is because they aren't as mainstreamy as the rest of the people in those other organizations, right? Like those other political parties. So they want to have their own little spin, but no one else seems to really want to do that. And so then they feel lost, right? And so they become political orphans, and eventually they say, oh, let's give this libertarianism stuff a try. They talk about freedom. And so then they initially, that's why they join, and they look for other people who are interested in practicing their freedom in similar ways. So basically, people who are more too radical for Democrats, or people who are too serious about reducing the size of government in the Republican Party, they leave and they try to find a new home. So how does it end? Well, they turn on each other, right? Because of the differences in priority. So you can say, oh, we all love each other. Okay, including the Hitlers of the world, right? Including all of the hateful, all those other people. What about those? Oh, not them. And so eventually you begin to see that they start eating their own, right? Because the priorities are different, or because people want to go in a different direction all over again, right? they believe that their own spin, their own idea, or their what do you call it, spin on the idea needs the spotlight at the expense of everybody else. Um, so now they begin to hate each other. And I already mentioned a couple situations, right? Especially in the liberal woke spectrum, right? We begin to see that feminists, are not in agreement with trans women any longer. In fact, trans women will call feminists, haters, which is kind of weird, right? Um, Also, you'll see pro-peace Republicans start having trouble with pro-life Republicans. Green energy proponents will start having conflict with environmentalists, right? Because a lot of the green energy initiatives eventually destroy the environment. I don't know if you saw that story that the Scottish government, or the Scottish government, I don't even know what you call it anyway, but the authorities in the Scotland section of Great Britain, they basically approved the cutting down of millions of trees to clear the way for certain green initiatives like solar panels. And so there's that thing where, okay, what do you want? Green energy to save the environment? Or do you just want to have green energy and screw the environment? That kind of situation. And so whenever you have this kind of awakening out of your superficial understanding of a certain concept, you begin to hear things like, you're not really X, right? You're not really a libertarian. You're not really a woke person or a liberal person or Republican, etc. Whatever, insert whatever you want in X. And when you start hearing people say things like that, well, party time is over. The time of superficiality is over. There had been a shakeout. A lot of people have seized power in this feel good era, a time period where you're gathering numbers. And now you realize, you're the only one that really believed in something while everyone else was seizing power. And now you're kind of out of luck once again. Now, something you might want to consider, and yes, I know how silly this suggestion may be to someone who is fanatical about what it is that they believe. But in the interest of just having a conversation of where do we go from here, like what would be perhaps a better starting point where everyone gets to do what they want? Uh, well, and I've suggested this before. Why don't we focus on principles rather than issues? And so, as long as you abide by the principle, then you can add on whatever issue you want. And so, even though you do meet up with someone who has a different take on a specific issue, it's okay, because the principle that you're abiding by is going to be respected and kept. Okay. Now, generally, things happen in the opposite way. In other words, people try to find, points in common with someone else, right? It's like, oh, we have a lot in common. And generally, you have one thing in common. That's the starting point, right? You meet at a club. Oh, we have something in common. We both go to the same club, dance club, social club, whatever. And that's where you begin your journey together. That's the point of commonality that you have with each other. Or maybe it's fashion. Hey, we wear the same clothes, or we have the same taste in clothes, or that person likes my taste in clothes, whatever. But that's one point that you have in common, right? Or as a sport, right? Oh, we like the same team. We like the same sports. Okay, whatever. And it can be conceptual too, where you say, hey, we're fighting oppression by fighting the rich. Okay, well, that's just one thing. And then once you establish that as something that you agree to, where do you go from there? Now, as long as you stay superficial, right, you don't go into detail, or you don't pay attention to the details, or you don't really listen too carefully, everything is fine. You get along with each other, right? Especially in the concept of love. I love you, right? Well, what's the focus there? Attraction, right? So as long as you fixate on the mutual attraction, everything's fine. But once you start having conversations like, oh, okay, so what do you think about this political candidate or that political candidate? Well, now you have to actually get into the weeds of the person's mind And maybe that attraction changes a little bit, right? Like maybe you find out that this person is just a little bit too annoying or too laid back or not serious or too lazy. You're going to find out details about that other person beyond just simply the physical attraction. So as long as you stay superficial, everything's fine, right? And in order to maintain superficiality, you really have to dumb down the population, right? None of it really matters. Oh, we'll just get along. Oh, don't make a big deal out of it. Live in the moment. Okay, all of these kinds of strategies kind of sort of presuppose a certain level of superficiality, right? Just focus on the emotion, how you feel in that moment. But as soon as you do have meaningful conversations like about the future, what are we going to do next year? What if we have kids? What do we teach them? Serious questions of life. Well, that's when everything starts to go downhill, right? You made the mistake of paying attention or having a conversation about something heavy, asking the person's opinion on something that you've never talked about before. Things generally diverge. And this is not unlike what I discussed yesterday when it came to racializations. Now, each of us are individuals. Each of us have an infinite number of racial categories that we can be put into. And to put it in a more colloquial, a more sort of everyday way to say it, well, we have different interests, we have different likes, we have different opinions, we have different thoughts about lots of different things, okay? And you don't really figure them out until you have a conversation. You get to know the other person a little bit more. I've said before, it's sort of like, and this is not just true in the United States, this is worldwide phenomena, that if you've never seen a white person before, if you've never seen a black person before, right, they all look alike, okay? So in America, it's considered racist if you say, well, all Asians look alike. Well, duh, right? Because you've never met anyone before. And the initial difference causes a person to basically see everyone as the same. But the more you get to know people in that racialization, the more differences that you begin to see. And so then that's why you'll see in America, at least anyway, oh, I can tell the difference between Japanese, Korean, and Chinese people, right? So you begin to hear that kind of interesting phenomena, right? Where on the one hand, it sounds like you're sort of more superior to other people. No, it just means you have more information than others. You've gotten over that initial unfamiliar sort of mentality that you initially had. So in the same way, right, every person that you meet is probably far more interesting than you are letting yourself understand. But since you're only going to focus on the issue, that's your starting point, well, then you don't know where it's going to go from there, right? Conservatives and liberals will like the same sport, right? But your politics, everything, your religion, everything is going to be different after that. So if you start with, that's an example, if you start with uh, something that you share in common with each other, potentially things can go horribly wrong. Okay, so instead of doing that, you focus on principles, right? So where would you find principles? Well, interestingly enough, you could find it at political party conventions, maybe not national ones, but maybe on more local ones, right? If you say, well, I subscribe to, say, for example, the Constitution, right, as a starting point, or my starting point is rejection of the Constitution, whatever. But there's a certain principle, at least. And of course, it gets upset when you have planks on your platform. But if you remain true to the convictions or the statement, of the political party, then that would be a good starting point, right? And so the chances are you will have more, like if you're a Republican, you'll probably find someone with whom you can work things out a little bit better at a Republican convention as opposed to a Democratic convention. I'm just saying, generally speaking, okay? Just because the starting point, the principle that you're going to both start with is going to be more in line with each other. This is why religious organizations generally tend to be extremely popular when trying to find people with a similar worldview, right? It's not guaranteed that everything will be the same. Like I said, we're all individuals. And so you may share the same belief, but everything else is going to be different. School reunions, perhaps, or even a dating website like for the unvaxxed. Unjected.com is something I stumbled on not that long ago, right? So you're going to start with something that resembles some sort of philosophical outlook on life, whether it's through a shared education, uh, education curriculum or certain attitudes towards jabs, whatever. So you can just basically stick a flag in the earth on your hill and see who shows up. But clearly, the more specific, the more sort of detailed a position is, the higher the cost is going to be, right? So, in other words, anyone who's looking at you, they're going to see what you say you represent. Okay, that would be the first test, and then they see what you look like, what you do for a living, all this other stuff, right? And that's that journey that always happens, right? So most times today, people will say you have something in common, and that's where you stay, right? So you never get into the conversation of, oh, so what do you like to do on weekends, right? Because everything is always fixated on the activism, right? But as soon as the activism period is over and now you're sort of having a conversation, everything starts to fall apart. Right. So you can't ignore the cost. You can try to hide the cost. You can delay the cost, but there's always going to be a cost. Right. So you stick a flag, but by sharing a certain principle, right, then there is the possibility of working things out. Right. So coming back to cost, I made an episode not that long ago that marriage is the most discriminatory thing that you could ever possibly do if you believe in the institution of marriage, because you're going to be monogamous, right? Well, assuming the traditional understanding of marriage, right? Something like that, where you're going to be committed lifelong to a certain person. Well, you're discriminating against everybody else, right? There is a criteria that you're going to use that you're basically going to say no to everybody else. That's the cost. And so the more discriminatory you are, the more picky you are, the higher your standards, however you want to express it, yeah, there's a higher cost. Okay. And so the pickier you are, the higher the probability that you won't find someone, right? Because that person doesn't exist, right? Because you're essentially looking for yourself. And, then that gets kind of weird, right? But if you believe in freedom, then hey, you leave it at that. And I said in another episode, libertarians have to trust that belief in freedom, right? And so any discussion that you have with someone else who you think you can get along with, well, does your belief fall in line with the idea of freedom? Is it consistent? And I got to tell you that with my wife, this is how I always do it, right? Is it consistent with, I know you don't believe me, probably, but it's true. That's what I did. It wasn't the concept of freedom so much specifically, but it was basically that's the way I was able to resolve a lot of conflict with my wife, particularly in the very early period, the first 3 months of our marriage. That's basically how I'm still alive today, 26 years later. Anyway, so things have gotten really extreme and there's a lot at stake. And so there's a lot of emotion and anger and, backstabbing and betrayal. And as I said in another episode, it's because of the Fed, right? Because of all this money printing, people believe that they can afford choices, afford criteria and standards, which are actually extremely expensive and is way too expensive for your budget. And so as soon as we can get the Fed, right, to basically no longer be a factor in our lives, and we start to roll back a lot of the moral hazards and all of the crazy price tags on a lot of the choices that we have here, well, then now you get to go back to a more radical mindset, right? And radical in the sense of root. You're going to look for root cause, root principles through which you can build your life. and then realize that, yeah, you actually have a lot in common with a lot more people. And a lot of this divisiveness that we see is pretty much fueled by easy money policies. Well, that's it. So, some thoughts on people trying to find points to agree with other people, positive takeaways from discussion. And for me, it always comes back to principles. Well, are you abiding by this principle or not? And if you are not, eventually others will figure it out as well, and you won't get along with each other anymore. But if you adhere to those principles, then you have lifelong relationships. Interesting discussions, since people are always bringing their different perspective to the table. Anyway, that's some food for thought. I thought I would share it, and I will talk to you next time.